second bullet point goes away?
Yeah.
And the second bullet point is preemptive.
So, under section 12 in the document we're looking at, you're gonna add that language in somewhere else, or you're gonna modify that?
On page 30, that
Modified.
language exists.
Okay, I thought you meant, okay. So they'll say, in addition, wireless equipment shall not
Obstruct.
obstruct the view of commercial business, yada, yada, yada,
As determined
as
by.
determined by the plane developer. Got
Yep.
it.
All right? All right, so that takes us under location.
And probably should add, I'm sure over a period of time, we'll come up with some parameters as what obstruct means.
We had the word interfere before.
Yeah.
They thought obstruct was more specific.
That's fine.
But
But I
Still
think,
begs the same question, but it's probably a little more forceful in terms of what you're looking for.
absolutely,
Right.
better defined and a practice will develop.
Okay.
Many years of litigation.
There you go.
All right, under location for new poles, page 28.
Job security.
We've already talked about the last three. The first two cannot be located within 50 feet of a single-family residential structure. Number two, cannot be located within 15 feet or 100% of the pole height, whichever distance is greater from a single-family residential structure. Mr. Teal, you want to comment on those two?
The first bullet, not located within 50 feet of a single-family residential structure. We talked about that at the last meeting. I think that's preempted because it, in essence, would be a de facto ban because we clarified most of our lots here
Right.
are 50 feet or smaller. So that one, I think, is,
No, let me ask you if you add the words where possible to it.
well, I mean, we had talked, and I think we need to come back because I don't know what we landed on in terms of that best practices thing, but this would be one of those probably that would fit under that category, you know, so that's a criteria that the planning department can review to suggest, hey, you know, you might want to, you know, move it over. And then, you know, if it can be done, it can be done. If not, you know, no.
And that would, and also go back to the second paragraph, I'll call it, the second bullet point, where the last two we struck out, those we kind of said might be a best practice as well, correct?
Correct, yeah, because, I mean, this gets into how far back on the lot does the resident sit, and, you know, there's a lot of zoning requirements that configure exactly where the structure is. So having just a blanket rule that says, you know, can it be located within 15 feet or 100% of the whole height, pole height? Now, I get that came out of our really super tall poles, if they're located on private property.
Now, where
from a
you
safety-
talk, now, where you think I'm pointing to?
Oh, sorry, I thought you were looking at the second bullet point under that,
Under which?
under location for new poles,
Oh.
page 28.
We moved down to the next one.
Okay, so okay, I had jumped back up top.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I
Oh,
had jumped back
okay.
up top because we got talking about best practices, and I was just saying, the second and third bullet point under page 22's stuff, where we adopted the first one.
The trees and the
Yeah,
driveways
those were
behind it.
best practice, we kind of highlighted that as a best practice type
Yeah,
of,
we
type
can,
of thing,
sure.
right? Okay, all right, so going back to number two, as you were just
And then
about
actually,
about.
Mr. Beckton, even if you go all the way to the very first one, 2 and 3, we can have those as best practices.
You mean 3 and 4?
Sorry, 3 and 4, correct.
Okay, all right. Okay. All right, so that takes us down to, once again, the second bullet point under page 28.
Right.
What were you
First
saying?
one's preempted.
First one's preemptive.
First one's preempted.
What were you commenting on the second one?
The second one, I think, is preempted as well, just because of the fact that, really for the same reasons, I think, as the first one. I understand where this requirement comes from, which is from the really tall cell towers that we've got, like 180 feet kind of thing. There's a safety requirement for if the pole were to fall over and collapse, it has to be set back from the certain distance that, at least the pole height, I think, is what the standard is, but that's just so if it falls over, it doesn't smash anything. I don't know that we have that issue with these so much, but I don't think it's translatable to small cells as it is for the tall poles. So I think it's something that would be preempted.
Why wouldn't it be policy? No, I want to just ask a clarification. You're saying it's preempted because it's not a safety concern? Or are you saying it's preempted because we're not allowed to have any setback? Because the de facto ban, I understand your rationale that a 50-foot might essentially de facto ban it from residential areas. 15 feet, based on what Mr. Killingsworth said, is certainly not, I mean, most houses are set back much more than 15 feet. So we're
Well,
only
the
really
reason-
protecting a few houses that are really close to the
Right,
right-of-way.
reason being is because we don't have a similar requirement for other structures that are in the right-of-way, like a light pole. So from a safety standpoint, if we want to say it's a safety issue, then we don't have any, if a light pole falls over, it's, you know, those same requirements aren't in place for light poles. And so, I don't think that we can require it of small cell providers when we don't require it for the other stuff that's in the right-of-way.
The difference being light poles don't have multiple pieces of refrigerator-sized equipment on them, which make them heavier. So if telecom is putting multiple pieces of equipment, which we want them to do, let's say there's an existing wood pole, we want to encourage them to co-locate. That's what we've done in our ordinance. Now you have multiple
But you do
large
have
equipment.
electric poles that have transformers on them.
But a
I
transformer.
can imagine those are just as big and massive and heavier probably than
And
than
not
their.
only, not only that, but we require a certification from their engineer that it's structurally sound enough to be able to support the weight of the equipment in hurricane situations, you know, those kinds of things. So that's already going to be kind of built into what product we allow them to use to put it in the right-of-way.
Now, it's my understanding that the fall down ordinance that you're talking about, the Part A of this particular ordinance, Mr. Killingsworth mentioned at the last meeting that it governs towers on private property. There are restrictions. So if I'm a private property owner, a commercial piece of property, and I want to put a tower, I have to make sure that it's set back from residential. I know that the ordinance might have been intended for some large towers, but it is broad enough to cover small cell towers. It in fact includes camouflage towers. They don't have to be 80 feet, they can be 15 feet. And so we have an ordinance currently on the books where we restrict people putting it on their private property, and we want setbacks from single-family residences. So why should we allow a telecom carrier to put it in the right-of-way and not have the same restriction? I mean, it's the same concern. We're kind of doing it, we're restricting a private property owner, but we're not restricting telecom in a city right-of-way.
Because the state has preempted us on small cells.
Except to the extent.
And not large towers. That's,
Except to the extent that we have a concern about the location, context, and safety, which is what, Mr. Teal's been focused on, and I would just put
Well,
forward that we have a similar concern.
Well, his point, as I understand it, as he's made on several occasions, is the fact that for those poles where these go in the right-of-way, the JEA poles, the city light poles, or JEA light poles, FDOT light poles, they don't have this restriction. And so he's saying, correct me if I'm wrong here, that we can't single these guys out without somehow going back in our code and unilaterally making everybody under this type of restriction.
We're singling them out on, if I'm a private owner and Verizon wants to pay me to put it on my property, I cannot allow it if it's close to a residence currently. So you are singling out Verizon with regard to private property owners, putting it on theirs. You're just not having the same standard in the right-of-way. So we do have two different standards. And my understanding is that they're going to roll this out in the right-of-way. They're also going to roll it out on private property because that's how they've done wireless currently. I mean, there's 4G in the right-of-way and there's 4G on people's private properties. So we have two different standards as it currently is. We're just saying, let's just apply the same standard we've already been living under for private property owners and have it for right-of-way.
Scott, if you're right, which I don't agree you are, but if you're right, putting it on private property, you have those limitations that are already in the ordinance now. I think what happened when Jason was explaining, kind of conflated the two together. He said, I think it's preempted. He should have paused for about 10 seconds and said, now I understand where you're coming from because of the safety issue. I understand where it's coming from, but unrelated to that, it's preempted.
Well, I listened to the because. He said it's preempted because, and he had reasons, and I'm saying here are the reasons why I would argue I disagree with the because part. I mean,
Okay.
so I get what you're
All
saying.
right, let's move on. When I say move on, let me bring it back to committee, so to speak here. Colleagues, Do y'all have any thoughts on what you've heard debated here?
Confused. I really don't fully understand the ramifications. What I'm hearing, I think I'm hearing, is that for Scott's argument that